you.
There we go.
Okay.
We are good to go, guys, and much smoother than the start last week.
Oh, I like the start last week.
The start last week was
wonderful.
very, very us. We're down to earth.
I'll cut it out.
Yeah. It's, what you see is what you don't really get or understand.
No, I still don't.
Not at all.
No.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us at Scots of War again. And our blether last week was sort of unaccountably popular, so thanks very much if you tuned in last week. We're going to actually try and respond to the questions that were sent to us this week. So if you have anything you'd like to chip in on the discussion, just send us a message and we'll do our best to get the question up. The book that we're going to be having a little look at today is a bit of a forgotten classic. It's With the Incomparable 29th. Obviously, this is maybe appearing back to front, who knows. It was republished recently by Pen and Sword, where it was retitled by Richard Van Inden, This Bloody Place. The book first appeared in 1919, and as far as I'm aware, was never reprinted again after that until it came out in this Pen and Sword edition. It was renamed This Bloody Place because it was thought that the original title of With the Incomparable 29th was a little bit opaque. It didn't really tell the reader very much about the book, but that is the absolute thrust of this book here. We're actually dealing with the memoirs of a Scottish territorial officer who was part of the 29th Regular Division, and that is what makes this title so important. I was a wee bit miffed when the title was changed, because that is the whole point of this thing, that this is the experience of a territorial who was deemed worthy, deemed sort of, well-trained or whatever, or just expedient, to be attached in 88 Brigade to the 29th Regular Division, which was the last regular division of the old BEF, and that is what makes that title underneath so important. Okay, chaps, yeah, where are we going to take it? What sort of questions are we thinking about? What sort of things are we going to be examining?
Well, I'll go right ahead. One of the things that's particularly interesting to me is the aspects surrounding the makeup of the 29th Division. As you know, as we talked a little bit about last week in regards to Luce, you had the differences between Luce into 1915, and particularly when the troops first landed Gallipoli almost, 105 years ago this year, 2 weeks from now. You have troops of regular divisions, territorial divisions, and New Army or Kitchener divisions. But the 29th is really interesting because it's a mix-up of territorial battalions as well as regular Army battalions who've been stationed overseas when the war began and came back to Britain to form up. So really, I think it's an interesting look at the ad hoc nature in which the British Army is deploying. And also, I think it's an interesting look, and Muir talks about this really particularly, at the experience of not only territorial soldier, but a British soldier who's going overseas for the first time and serving in the non-European environment in many ways.
Yeah.
Do you guys pick up on certain, especially just where he starts when they first arrive in Alexandria?
This is very true. So, like when you look at the Western Front memoirs, a lot of the guys are just like, well, we left Britain, we got on a cross-channel ferry, and more or less 24 hours later, we were in France, and it wasn't wildly different to the south of England. Obviously, you sometimes have mention of the roadside estaminet, the sort of crucifix cavalry scenes that you often see in by the roadside in Belgium and France. But other than that transportation from the UK to the theatre of war is not really commented on, and that is one of the interesting things in Muir's book. And he actually mentions that this is for the first time a lot of these lads are not only leaving Scotland, but are going to somewhere that is notably very different. And this will probably be the first, and even if they survive, like the last time that they will ever go there. And that's one of the most poignant things in the closing passages of the book, where Muir is reflecting on the withdrawal from Gallipoli. He wasn't there himself at that point. He wrote from the point of view, knowing full well that it was highly unlikely that he would ever step foot on the Gallipoli Peninsula again. I think that's quite a significant point.
Yeah, I think the fact that there were so many territorials involved, in particular in this division, is very interesting. Obviously, if you're for the regular battalions that are involved, a lot of the men had service in India, experience of service overseas like this, and so do some of the territorial NCOs and senior officers. But it is a very new thing. It's very different to serving in France, and given the losses that are sustained and just the general geography of how far away they are, there's absolutely no hope of bringing bodies back. I think we'll come on to this a bit later, but it had, if anything, an even worse effect on these home areas, which were so, which so many of the territorials came from, particularly Edinburgh in the case of this. I think we need to consider that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because this is really, even though we think about this as separate from the Western Front quite often, this is one of the first major British engagements of the First World War. And apart from a large mistake of people thinking it was almost all Australians and New Zealanders,
absolutely.
This is also one of the first major battles in which a large amount of, especially non-regular Scottish troops are committed. It's not until June that the 52nd Division is landed, which is the Lowland Territorial Division, which the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles originally separated from. Do you guys want to comment just on that and how this battle in particular impacted the industrial and the population centers of Scotland for the first time in the Great War?
Yeah, certainly. Jumping in there, obviously the major battle for Edinburgh, obviously the 5th Royal Scots were what you might call like first day landers. They landed on the peninsula on the opening day of the campaign, the 25th of April 1915, but they weren't actually in the initial waves of the landings. It's quite telling that as territorials they were kept back until the evening and arrive on the beach once the main heights around W and V Beach have been captured. The real big battle for Edinburgh actually comes on the 28th of June in quite, an extraordinarily overlooked action, which has been known by various different names, but is mainly known by the Battle of Gully Ravine. And essentially to capture a network of Turkish trenches, Ottoman trenches, called the H system, H11, H12, they are essentially sent over the top without really any artillery preparation whatsoever. On the what you might call sort of like the right-hand side of Gully Ravine looking north, 86th Brigade make a quite successful attack with artillery preparation, but the casualties that are suffered by the 4th and 7th Royal Scots and the 7th and 8th Cameronians are absolutely devastating. That battalion, 156th Brigade, they're losing, I think it's 3 out of 4 of their commanding officers. They actually lose their brigadier in the front line that day. And Edinburgh is actually plunged into mourning. The whole town closes. The shops are shut. The trams are basically not running. And one of the great sources for this, the Edinburgh Evening News, there are pages upon pages upon pages of casualty notices. And the whole town is affected in such a way, and it sounds almost paradoxical, but there was such a shock to Edinburgh that it was almost not spoken about. There was no point in speaking about it because so many men in Edinburgh and so many families had been killed or wounded that it was almost a universal experience for that period of sort of April, May, June 1915. Quite astonishing.
Yeah, I sort of went over this a little bit last week with these sort of citywide mourning situations, like after the Battle of Lewes later that same year in Dundee, remembering the 4th Black Watch being such a terrible day for the city. It was similar to, it was similar to what happened in Edinburgh. But I think we tend to hear less about what happened in Edinburgh, and I think that is indicative of the fact that the Western Front seems to take precedence in the memory of the war. I think it's quite important. I don't know if anyone wants to expand upon that.
Well, I think one of the factors that really affected Edinburgh was that the casualties of the 28th of June are coming less than a month after the Gretna disaster, which still to this day is Britain's worst railway disaster, which took place on the 22nd of May. That was actually carrying the 7th Royal Scots, well, two companies of the 7th Royal Scots from Larbert down to Liverpool. And they're caught up in a train wreck just on the Scottish border, and those two companies are essentially wiped out. So it's really only about 50% of the 7th Royal Scots that actually make it into action, and of those, there's more casualties later on. So I think in many respects, even the morning of the 28th of June 1915 is to an extent overshadowed by the terrible losses of over 200 men of the 7th Royal Scots, which occurred just a few weeks before in the borough of Leith, obviously now like a suburb of Edinburgh, but was its own independent place back then.
And I think that's really interesting to touch on as well, because Scottish communities are going to mourn differently. And as we mentioned, especially Gully Ravine, and then in other actions with the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles these are predominantly territorial battalions. There are regular battalions. Kingsland Scottish Borders is also famous. The 29th Division. Royal Scots Fusiliers are present there. And of course, Scots serving in the non-infantry branches in Royal Artillery. Royal Naval Division is very heavy Scottish presence as well. But I think it's interesting because we're talking really about these territorial battalions, especially the Edinburgh ones. Queen's Edinburgh Rifles stands out among them as really middle and upper class units before the war.
Oh yeah.
You had Dave. You can correct me on how much what's a monthly or yearly fee to be a member of the battalion.
Oh yeah. To start off, you had to come up with £1 before. In the pre-war years, it was £1 or 10 shillings to join. And essentially, there were fees on top of that for camps, mess bills, ammunition, the whole lot. An awful lot of the rankers of the 4th and 5th, if they survived Gallipoli, as we were saying last week, end up being the second lieutenants of 1916.
Well, I think that's I've never really heard that much else about paying to be in the military. Before. So these are pretty well-to-do battalions compared to, say, the 7th and 8th Scottish Cameronian Scottish Rifles, who are known as, Glasgow Keeleys. They are the working class of the 8th is predominantly from what is now like the Springburn, North Glasgow area, and the 7th are predominantly from the south side, compared to more illustrious territorial battalions out of Glasgow, like the 9th Highland Light Infantry, the Glasgow Highlanders, who are very similar in regards to wealth and who they are, like the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. So for Glasgow, this is a hugely impactful day as well, a hugely impactful campaign, but it doesn't get the same press coverage as, say, the 1st of July 1916 does, when you have the 3 Glasgow City battalions suffering heavy casualties. And I think part of that has to do, and more research needs to be done on this, but I think part of that really has to do with the fact that the casualties of Gallipoli from Glasgow territorials are mainly lower class battalions. They're not the working and middle class men of the city battalions or the battalions where it took some social status to be a member before joining.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, sort of just to follow on from that same idea, it sort of emphasizes how much the city was impacted again by this, because the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles battalions were correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but they were basically made up from the original city guilds. Like there was this, when they were the Edinburgh Rifle Volunteers, there was like the stockbrokers company. And
this is why you get such a lot of what you would call sort of like upper middle class professionals serving as privates, because there were artisan companies. But there was the banking company, the stockbrokers company, sort of like the writers to the Signet, sort of like the top flight solicitors and lawyers. There was the company of archers. They had their own company within it, sort of thing. Yeah, so these are these are very, very well connected people. One of the things that really touches me in with the Incomparable 29th is the death of Lieutenant Robert Maule. And he was a former pupil of the school that I now have the pleasure of working at, Daniel Stewart's College. And, he was, an exceptionally well-connected chap. I might just share the screen with our school roll of honor.
And while Dave is getting that set up, I'll also point out that we have a bunch of people watching right now, 10 whole people.
Oh, yes.
But if anybody now or later has any questions, feel free to put them in. And this week we actually have someone watching for questions, so we'll be happy to answer those as we go on.
Okay, let's have a wee look here. Bear with me, folks. And there we are. So can we see this here? Yeah, this is our school roll of honor entry for Lieutenant Robert Maule, whose death is described quite movingly by Albert Muir. And as you can see straight away, this is the only son of the late Sir Robert Maule. So we get a bit of an idea of his social standings here. He's mobilised with the 5th Royal Scots, attained the rank of lieutenant, killed in action on the 25th of May. And this is the really moving page in the book, if you've seen it, where they go down to the beach to bathe, and we'll come back in a little minute to think about the conditions on Gallipoli. And perhaps the most moving thing about Robert Maule was he didn't actually. It sounds stupid. He didn't actually need to be there. He was actually like the HQ liaison officer. So spent most of his time ducking and diving on the beach, on the landing beaches, not particularly a safe place, as we'll see. But he was actually on Sir Ian Hamilton's command staff, and he essentially begged to be allowed to go into the firing line because there had been so many casualties, and he'd been there a matter of hours before he was killed. And obviously he's buried at night because any large gatherings of men draw shell fire, sort of thing. And this has again sort of like quite an impact on the structure of Edinburgh, because there were 2 very large department stores in Edinburgh at the time. Jenner's, which is still just about there at one end of Princes Street, and at the west end of Princes Street, Maule's, which was a very big department store. And Robert Maule's death is essentially one of the reasons why that hugely well-known Edinburgh landmark stops being Maule's and becomes Binns a few years later on. It then becomes the House of Fraser, and it's now a whiskey bar. So yeah. So do we want to talk a little bit about the conditions on the Gallipoli Peninsula? Because anybody that's ever seen like the Mel Gibson thing, or has ever obviously been to southern Turkey, can work out the fact that they're going to somewhere that's rather hot. But of course, one of the interesting things is it's only hot there for half of the year, and obviously sort of like the autumnal and the winter weather is the same as, if not worse, than Scotland. So what can we pick up about the actual living and fighting conditions in Gallipoli? What's the big contrast from Gallipoli to the Western Front there?
Well, the seasonal difference is a big thing. I think that immediately kind of negates what I was saying earlier about some of the regular soldiers having experience in India and things, because unless they're stationed up in the hills in Shimla or wherever, they're not going to have the experience of that sort of that winter, basically, and how bad it would actually get. For the territorials, of course, most of them have never served abroad before. It was pretty bad. But I think the book really illustrates quite how bad it was, obviously through its description, but also by the fact that Muir only lasted a little over a month there. Before he basically had a complete mental and physical breakdown. And I don't think any of us could blame him for that. He'd basically gone from being a company commander to the commanding officer of the battalion in a month. And I don't know if you want to expand on how it actually affected him. I mean, you've read the book more than I have.
Yeah, obviously the thing here is sort of like with with the territorial battalions, obviously all soldiers are going to be affected by the comrade's death, regardless of whether the new army, territorial, regular, whatever. But Muir had been commissioned into the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles in 1905, so he'd had 10 years of service. So the people that he was serving with, the people that he was fighting and essentially seeing die on a daily basis, were not only his sort of, his compadres in the battalion. They were men that he would have known in his social life, in his working life, and this, it must have been doubly hard. What hits him particularly hard is the deaths, as we've said, of his subalterns, of Robert Maule and Charles Kemp, who was another former pupil from Daniel Stewart's college. So, to watch a battalion that has been, part of the fabric of not only your sort of like what you might call military life, but your professional life and indeed your personal life destroyed in front of your eyes on a day-to-day basis, must have been absolutely devastating. He mentions there that he's getting a little over 2 hours sleep a day, and maybe not all at the same time. So it's no wonder that this happens to men.
Yeah, I want to add on to both of these points about life at Gallipoli and about Muir's experience, because I think that one of the interesting things, particularly about Gallipoli, when you compare it to other fronts on the war, is just how draining it was to the body, not in terms of combat, but in terms of supplies. Every time I read about Gallipoli, whether it's a Scottish account, even an Ottoman account, any account, the thing that stands out to me is how amazing of a logistical feat it was to keep that force supplied. Especially when you compare it to the Western Front, where you could just have a box of supplies in Dover. In a few hours, it was in Calais or Dunkirk, and then later that day, later that week, it was in the hands of a Tommy, whether in the rear areas or in the front lines on the Western Front. Gallipoli is a whole nother experience, especially when you get down to the basics like drinking water, right? Disease is a huge killer and a huge drainer on morale and just the overall health of the force in Gallipoli. I can't quote an exact number, maybe one of you guys can, but there was a total number of men sick in the force at Gallipoli was consistently higher than any force on the Western Front, matched only possibly by the forces at Salonika. So, and you're going to run into tropical diseases. So the strain on the logistical service and on the medical service and the strain that the men in the front lines would experience from dealing with this basic hygiene, ration, and medical issues is going to be part of the reason why Gallipoli really stands out in a different light than other engagements of the First World War. And I think that's something really important to think about in every aspect, not only at Gallipoli, but really thinking about, particular for Gallipoli, just every move and how logistics relates to it, down to basic things like water.
Every drop of safe drinking water at the start of the campaign, obviously, seawater condensers were established later on. Every drop of that is brought originally from Egypt, and it's incredible to think that obviously, like the main August offensives at Suvla Bay, in part failed due to a lack of drinking water. When there is maybe a 48-hour period where no safe drinking water is landed at Suvla Bay, and you get entire divisions. I'm thinking about the territorial divisions that were sent to Suvla Bay and to the new army divisions. They literally cannot move forward through sheer exhaustion, lack of water. I've read, I don't know whether these accounts are apocryphal or not, but of guards being placed on mules because men were actually nicking the mules with jackknives and bayonets to try and wet their lips with their blood. This is how bad we're getting. And there's very, very little consideration given to the supplies that are being taken and issued in Gallipoli. For example, a can of corned beef, which has come from Egypt, you're going to be able to open that can and pour it out. Essentially, the fat would have melted, and you're then left with a biscuit like a roof tile, a pool of gelatinized fat and gristle, then surrounded and covered in flies within moments. Absolutely brutal.
So that kind of, you're explaining extreme heat issues, and that brings us to one of the first questions we have, which is from a young, I don't know if I want to call him a gentleman, but a young Kieran McElhenney in
Oh, I
Glasgow,
know that, man.
who's asking what were the winter conditions like in the Dardanelles for British troops, and how did the uniform change from hot and cold? Either of you want to particularly speak on a few examples of that?
Dave's the expert on that.
Well, I won't go that far. I think it speaks volumes for the fact that the 52nd Lowland Division are actually deployed in the height of summer, wearing sort of like what you might call like the Western Front surge uniforms, which of course are completely unsuitable in summer. They immediately discard the jackets and make shorts out of the trousers, but there's no resupply really until October time. And by this point, it's as cold really in Gallipoli during the night as it would be in Scotland. There is a huge storm at the end of November the 26th onwards, huge gales of rain, which is followed 48 hours later by 6, 7, 8 feet drifts of snow. And we're dealing with men that are in woolen uniforms, like woolen shorts, or other battalions that came in slightly later on in sort of like August time in khaki drill uniforms, what you might call sort of like the it ain't half hot mum uniform sort of thing. So they are completely taken by surprise by this and are completely unprepared. It was very, very telling. I was researching one of our chaps, one of our former pupils, a couple of days back. He was a machine gun sergeant in the Lovat Scouts, and he was actually awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal. When you say simply, but he was actually awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal simply for remaining on guard for 13 hours and keeping his machine gun working when the entirety of the rest of the machine gun section had been hospitalized. So at this point, we have one sergeant and 2 machine guns defending the Lovat Scouts front line. And there isn't actually much by way of interference from the Ottoman forces, because, I mean, God bless them, they're in exactly the same situation themselves. But to be given a Distinguished Conduct Medal, which in 1915 is no mean feat, to be given a Distinguished Conduct Medal for enduring weather gives you an idea of what the weather must have been like towards the end of the campaign. Quite incredible, quite incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to say, should we go on from there a little bit, unless Trim's got something else to add to this, just to talk a bit about the actual fighting conditions in Gallipoli, particularly the landings. There is a part in the book, well, there's quite a long part in the book where he's describing conditions on the beaches at various points, but in the initial landing, obviously you said he doesn't take part in that, but he does watch quite a lot of what's happening. He watches the assault from the SS River Clyde, which has been beached, and the attempts by, I can't remember which regiment it is, I think it's a regular one, basically to build a bridge of boats across one after the other all the way to the beach.
Yeah, the Dublins and Munster lads, yeah.
This costs so many lives to do because the Turks or the Ottomans are able to basically train guns right from the top of the cliffs onto them. And that really, I mean, as a historian, I think as historians we always try to sort of look objectively at accounts like this, but that is something that I've really found extremely moving. And it's kind of one point in this book that I really have so much respect for the fact that they had to build that thing, so they did it, and it didn't matter how many people they lost. There was no other way of doing it.
No messing about,
And I mean, that just gives an idea of what the fighting conditions were actually like and what they had to go through. I don't know if you want to expand on what things happened in the later battles. Obviously, Gully Ravine was terrible as well, but
one of the things that really strikes me, and it on the one hand, I really admire Muir for this, but on the other hand, I have to sort of think, this shouldn't have been the way that it was. His first experience in battle is in the May battles around Fir Tree Wood, where essentially they are trying to just push the line further up the slopes of Ashi Baba, trying to buy more land in order then to be able to land reinforcements, because there was nowhere on the peninsula that wasn't under fire and you couldn't land reinforcements safely. And the 5th Royal Scots are simply given the instruction that they will attack Fir Tree Wood at 5 o'clock and capture it. And that was that. You know, we're looking at very, you know, sort of like what you might call like these early sort of, the mindset almost of sort of like the late Victorian period here. This, you know, a battle is something that happens in one day. You are given a short, very clear order, and you simply go and do it. You know, by this point, such a thing, you know, like you were to attack this objective at this time. Which part of the objective? Who's on our flanks? Where's our artillery covered? Do we have any specialist stores? You know, do we have signals? Do we have hand grenades? Do we have more ammunition? And you know, this is the sort of thing that we're starting to look at on the Western Front. But you know, these men are given a scrap of paper about an hour before they're told to attack, and by God, they actually do it. They manage to successfully assault and then capture one corner of Fir Tree Wood in the face of absolutely incredible odds, with very, very little artillery support and with virtually no communications whatsoever. You know, this is essentially still the days of the runner. And for me, his description of the capture of Fir Tree Wood could have been anything out of any one of the sort of like earlier battles of the Boer War. You know, sort of like if we think about sort of like the earlier engagements of 1899, 1900, Colenso, something like that, go and do it, cross the river and attack. You know, quite incredible, quite incredible.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting just for me to read about this account, not only other ones, but just lack of basic information that you get fighting on the Western Front, especially at the same time. Talking about first off, going back to the landings, this isn't something that's particular to the First World War. It happens even in successful landings like D-Day. Landing in the wrong beach, famously the Australians don't land in the right beach. The River Clyde, when it's ran aground, the light resistance expectations obviously doesn't match up if they're landed right in front of Turkish machine gun positions. And then it battles like Gully Ravine, lack of basic land navigation skills, which you will see really drilled into troops on the Western Front, and then later so when a lot of these troops get sent to serve in Egypt and Palestine, it seems to just be a very basic understanding of warfare for a lot of these troops, and part of that is they just didn't expect to be there. So the interesting thing that comes through all of these fighting conditions in Gallipoli for me personally is the learning on the fly back to the basics. We talk about the British Army learning on the fly and the learning curve of the British Army on the Western Front, but they start from somewhere. It seems like the troops that are fighting at Gallipoli, whether through the experience that their battalions had before the war, regular territorial, or just through the expectation that this campaign wouldn't last very long, are learning very basic military principles all over again that would have been drilled into troops on the Western Front before they had left Britain. So that's another theme that I really pick up on.
Yeah, one of the incredible things is, you know, just almost to take it back to what we were saying before about the impact on communities. The attack on the 12th of July, which the 52nd Lowland Division largely carries, quite memorable is the assault of the 4th King's Own Scottish Borderers, who were sent unbelievably to capture a trench which doesn't exist. You know, the Royal Naval Air Service have photographed what they think is the third line of defences, sort of like sloping upwards on the forward slopes of Ashubaba. But it was clearly photographed late on in the day, deep shadow in a trench that was only about 18 inches deep. And, you know, brigades of this 52nd Lowland Division are sent to capture a trench which doesn't exist. It wasn't even a continuous stretch of trench. and as a result of that, you know, there are hundreds of men of the 4th KOSB that actually break through Turkish lines in search of this defensive feature, and it simply doesn't exist. When it's found, it's knee deep. And obviously these men are never seen again. You know, and it's these absolute basics which Muir actually goes quite a long way to sort of excuse. You know, he actually dedicates his book to General Sir Ian Hamilton there, and he basically is very proud of this sort of like learning on the fly, this very much extemporized nature, and oh yes, you know, every drop of water has come from Egypt. Isn't it magnificent? You're like, well, it is on one hand magnificent, but on the other hand, it's sort of not. Like, you know, the men that were here deserved a lot better, I would think. You know,
that is something that he sort of, the way that he writes all the way through the book, he does praise the army and the organization, and he's just not generally too critical about everything, even though everything's going wrong right until the end, obviously, when he has a complete breakdown. But I'm just thinking, for example, about how consistently through the book he talks about the impact that the Ottoman snipers had upon them, and the fact that a lot of men were killed by them. Also, the way that they hunted them down, particularly the way the Indian soldiers did it. He talks about a head falling out of a tree and a Gurkha climbing down, looking very pleased with himself and stuff. And he talks about it all so sort of eloquently, and like he's not all that bothered about it. And really, it does appear to just be kind of an act that he's put on in 1919, I think, to sort of get through it, because he becomes very frank about his feelings about it later on.
Yeah, certainly the sniper problem was a real issue in Gallipoli. It sounds paradoxical. This often surprises people, but in Gallipoli, you're actually far safer in the front line because in a lot of places, the British or Anzac troops or Indian troops are actually sharing a trench with the Ottoman forces, especially sort of like saps that would reach out into no man's land. They would be joined up and barricaded. So in many respects, you were actually safer, certainly safer from artillery in the front lines. So there was this constant switching between, you know, the sudden death from sniper fire in the front line, and then obviously the what you might call sort of like the random death of the shelling in the rear areas and the beaches, because there wasn't a single part of the Allied held positions that wasn't vulnerable to shell fire, which often surprises people, you know, when they say we went to the rear areas. There is no rear area really in Gallipoli. It's just about a mile away from the front line. And this is quite incredible. But the snipers obviously take a real toll. I'm thinking here about the commanding officer of the 8th Battalion Cameronians. I don't know if somebody, you know, Jim, you might want to jump in on that one there.
Yeah, I mean, the 8th as well as the 7th Cameronians get an absolute walloping at Gallipoli. One of the best accounts, and I would say contemporary and an equivalent of Muir, is the overall history of the 8th Scottish Rifles, which coincidentally is called With the 8th Scottish Rifles by a guy named Hannon, who takes over as the battalion commander of the 8th. And they complain about much of the same things that all other British troops are experiencing, particularly snipers. They talk about innovative ways they deal with snipers and innovative ways they start to overcome trench warfare, either from what they're hearing coming out of the Western Front or what they're inventing themselves through basic items like periscopes, basic items like different ways to carry water up to the front. So I think that is one thing that really separates the Gallipoli units, whether they be the Cameronians or any regiment of the British Army or the Australians for that matter, and Indians, is the experience they have learning about how to deal with this static trench warfare, which for the most part, a lot of these battalions, if they don't go to the Western Front after Gallipoli, aren't going to experience again for the rest of the war. So it is, you know, the 8th Scottish Rifles end up going and fighting very successful actions alongside the rest of the Lowland Division in Palestine and in Egypt. So Gallipoli always seems very much like a dark chapter where a lot of these officers who are being sniped and shot, a lot of these soldiers who are being killed, are going to create these battalion identities, which last through the end of the war. And there's always this question of, were you at Gallipoli, were you not? But it's going to be that one dark chapter in otherwise bright spots for these battalions where they're winning battles decisively. So for the 8th Scottish Rifles and all these battalions, they really get in depth with how they dealt with it. And you'll see this in Scottish memory and Scottish representation of the Gallipoli campaign later on. And we, if you ever go to Glasgow, get to Glasgow Green, because there's an amazing monument to the 7th Highland Light Infantry on Glasgow Green, which was another Gallipoli battalion, and the Gallipoli is very prominent in the memorial. And I don't know if you want to talk about any equivalents in Edinburgh, but
there are two beautiful memorials in St Giles Cathedral, and quite incredibly, the 4th Royal Scots Memorial actually starts life as a 28th of June Gully Ravine Memorial, with the names of the officers, and then obviously like the numbers of the NCOs and men placed on the memorial there. But perhaps the most striking thing is, a lot of memorials will have sort of like the regimental mottos. They might have, for example, biblical texts, that sort of stuff. But on a scroll, said to represent the actual scrap paper that came up into the firing line, is a mention from a General Beaver Delisle, GOC 29th Division, 156. The 4th Royal Scots were in 52nd Division, but had been seconded to the 29th, and what they chose to put on their memorial was "Well done, Royal Scots" across the bottom, which was written on a piece of paper and signed by Delisle and sent up into the front line. And they clearly treasured that, absolutely treasured that to the extent that they actually replicated it on their memorial. And the 4th Royal Scots Memorial in St Giles Cathedral is more or less specifically a memorial for the men that were killed on the 28th of June. That was such a moment, in their history.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because there's clear in the regiments that serve at Gallipoli, the battalions. Those battalions generally stand out in regimental histories of the First World War because of that Gallipoli experience. Gallipoli is a quintessential and core part of the Cameronian Scottish Rifle experience of the First World War, even though only 2 of the battalions were there. And so you get regimental stories which are still around to this day. There's one famous one of a sermon given by, I believe it's the chaplain of the 7th, who basically gives a good old Presbyterian sermon. Saying,
fire and brimstone stuff.
Basically, you're all sinners. You're all going to die in this attack, so just accept it. So there's these deep stories which come out, and I find that with the Royal Scots too. And really, I think it stands out among lowland regiments because of the territorial experience at Gallipoli, of the Lowland Division and the battalions assigned to other divisions.
Certainly one of the sad things about the 5th is, obviously they were the only territorials in the 29th Division, and they were obviously so proud of this, but they were to an extent outsiders. And the 5th are so badly battered in Gallipoli. I mean, I've roughly computed that we're dealing with about 160% casualty rate with the 5th. That they are withdrawn essentially as a fighting unit towards the end of the Gallipoli campaign, and they're replaced in 88 Brigade by the Newfoundland Regiment. And the 5th essentially never find themselves again. It's quite interesting, as we were saying about lose last week, when there were so many men killed, that there was a core survivor group that sort of like then propagated the battalion. The 5th were essentially, that was them for most of the rest of the war, and they only really see action again in 1918 as the 5th 6th Royal Scots. They're sent onto lines of communication in France in 1916, and actually, incredibly enough, some of the men, without orders or without any further instructions, actually volunteer to go up to the firing line on the evening of the 1st of July. And there are some 5th Royal Scots killed on the first day of July, in many respects, trying to help the lads of the 29th Division. But they're cut out of the 29th Division because they've basically been battered out of existence. And this is the thing, we were talking last week about this replacement rate. The 5th didn't really get replacements, and they just dwindle and dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. And you certainly see that in Muir's book, where the Colonel Wilson, James Wilson, an incredible man. He's missing for about 3 days behind Turkish lines, badly wounded, ill. The command devolves onto Major Andrew MacDonald. He's killed, and we're then down into, company commanders. Captain Craig McLagan, a legendary figure in the 5th Royal Scots, gets a DSO. But they just aren't reinforced, really. There is a smattering of officers that are sent out in the October-November period. But these are the guys that essentially turn up, they endure the terrible weather, and then they're sent off back to Lemnos, Mudros, back to Alexandria, and then to the Western Front. And the identity of the 5th dies at Gallipoli in many respects, and they end up being permanently amalgamated with the 6th Royal Scots. No hardship, because the 6th are in excellent.
So we have another interesting question from John Duncan.
Oh, yes.
Asking, do you feel that the French have been completely overlooked at Gallipoli?
Yes, to a certain extent. I don't know what you feel about this, but this is something that I've enjoyed greatly. Save up your pennies and buy this. You can see the editor's names there. There's a very, very good chapter in the book, if you just give me a moment, on the French part in Gallipoli. If you just give us a moment there. Where are we? Yeah, Simon House, Chapter 8, the French Dardanelles campaign, which is absolutely excellent. And that fills really in English language historiography the role of the French army there, sort of thing, because they play a significant part and quite a controversial part, because a lot of the French forces are withdrawn towards the end of the Gallipoli campaign to essentially kindle up the new Salonika campaign. And people sometimes say, well, what kills Gallipoli in many respects is its French political decisions to withdraw their troops to reinforce the Serbian army, which is one of the real death blows. But yeah, quite paradoxically, the French landings at Kunkala on the first day of the operation on the Asiatic side of the Narrows are entirely successful, and they are, they're completely overlooked, and they do a great job as a diversionary raid, and then they're withdrawn. So it's one of the real sort of like head-butting moments of the campaign, that they actually choose to reinforce the failure at the tip of Cape Helles, rather than reinforcing the French success. That initial landing by the French army is an unqualified success, really. So yeah. I think along with the Indian 29th Indian Brigade that fought there, the French have been very, very much overlooked as well.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think the French who fight at Gallipoli are absolutely fascinating. They fall under the term of the Armée d'Orient, the Army of the Orient. And they, as well as the large French naval presence that's there, several battleships, one sunk alongside the Royal Navy. And so it's very interesting as well to see who the French commit. There are a few metropolitan troops, being troops that actually come from France that were removed from the Western Front. And then the majority of the French force that actually serves are colonial troops, whether they be Zouaves, the Foreign Legion, a lot of African units, Madagascan units. So there's a large contingent of troops from the African continent, or who have been serving in the African continent. And those, again, these are going to be primarily troops that they move to Salonika afterwards. But their experience is very different. There's a brand new amazing book by George Cassar out on the French at Gallipoli, which I highly recommend. It's on my bookshelf, but I've only read the first few pages. But you really do have to think about the French participation at Gallipoli in the terms of France's war goals. Obviously, Britain, as a large imperial power, clear war goals, opening up the Black Sea to assist the Russians, obviously giving the Ottoman Empire a little bit of a push always helps the British imperial goals. But France is being invaded, right? So for France, while they also have an overseas colonial empire, the first and primary goal is get the Central Powers out of France. Defend French cities, defend the soil of the Sacred Mother, the patrie, the fatherland, and then also reclaim the lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine. So when the British say, hey, we have this cool idea, but it doesn't involve anything to do with liberating France, you can see why the French might be a bit lukewarm and don't necessarily commit as much to operations in what they call the Orient as the British do, with the exception of their alliance needs to support the Serbs. So I really highly would encourage checking out both the chapter in it's Reese Crawley and Michael Cicero's book on Gallipoli, which is a series of different articles, and then also George Cassar's new book on the French at Gallipoli. Because I highly encourage folks to learn about that. We also have I'm going to have two other comments here just for us to look at before we start to close off. One is from Vince Gillen, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, who was asking if there's anything good about the 5th Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, who are often overlooked. Obviously, an Argyll, the Argylls are a Highland battalion, but serving in the Lowland Division. Any good references or any good just notes on them?
Yeah. The 5th Argylls, they get a very, very thorough treatment in the official history of the 52nd Lowland Division. You can get a reprint here from Naval and Military Press. And what's particularly good about this is that it covers in detail the 12th of July attack, which is something for the first time that's really covered in the Crawley and Le Cicero book. The operations which are carried out in August and October and November that the 5th Argylls play a part in. But yeah, for a really even-handed account, I would say find yourself a copy of the 52nd Lowland Divisional History by R.R. Thompson, because again, as we were talking about sort of like the extemporized nature of the forces in Gallipoli, again, we have these, 2 Highland Light Infantry battalions and, an Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders battalion in the Lowland Division, like sort of thing. So yeah, for a greater look at that, I would certainly recommend this. The 5th Royal Scots have Muir's book. The 4th Royal Scots, and to an extent the 7th Royal Scots, have Major Ewing's book from Gallipoli to Baghdad. But for a lot of the other Lowland battalions, it's really your divisional history, your war diaries are the places to go, and local newspapers as well. Obviously, there's the impression that obviously under the Defence of the Realm Act, everything is going to be strictly censored. Paradoxically, certainly in Edinburgh, it's not, mainly because Edinburgh's got something like 15 daily and evening newspapers, and the censor cannot censor them all. And as a result of that, there are lots of letters, there are lots of snippets of information, there are lots of reports being sent back. So if you can get yourself down to the local archives and get into the local papers, there's a huge wealth of information to be found. But yeah, it's certainly chasing up the story of the 5th Argylls is hugely worthwhile.
Yeah, the other thing about the 5th Argylls is, like a lot of the Argylls battalions, somehow, it's just a bit of a coincidence, they had a photographer for a short amount of time while they were in Gallipoli, and the Imperial War Museum has a few of their photographs digitized, and it's something that's well worth looking at. They're sort of daily life scenes on the beaches, that's worth looking at.
Yeah, I would say Gallipoli and the Lowland Division are one of the better covered divisions in terms of primary sources and soldiers themselves writing. You've got great accounts from the 8th Scottish Rifles being with the 8th Scottish Rifles by Hannon. Then you've also got later on from Gallipoli a book called A Yarn of War, which is another account with the 8th. And then as well, you've got a few good Highland Light Infantry accounts. The 5th Highland Light Infantry's battalion history, which is written by their Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. It's another really good read, and the great thing about all of those is they're all available online for free now as PDFs, so you don't have to spend anything unless you want to. But we have another interesting question, and I'm going to open it up a little bit more than just for Gallipoli, and more than just for direct fire support. But this question is, how do you think how effective do you feel the Royal Navy was at providing support before major assaults, fire support before major assaults? And I would open that up to just a little bit more support in general and the relationship between the Royal Navy and the Army at Gallipoli. How do you feel that was undertaken? Do you think it was successful? What were some of the issues that you felt were highlighted in it?
The Royal Navy's firepower is obviously absolutely spectacular. You know, in terms of the weight of metal that the Royal Navy can put through the air, is absolutely phenomenal. But in many respects, the bombardments, and this is something that Muir mentions, the bombardments that you see on Gallipoli, some of the Royal Naval bombardments actually do surprisingly little damage. This is nothing to do with the Royal Navy. Of course, you know, the Royal Navy are there to fire, you know, very, very large caliber guns on flat trajectories at other ships. So obviously, you know, the Royal Navy do certainly the best job that they can, but what's needed a lot of the time in Gallipoli is sort of like plunging howitzer fire. And a lot of the trouble that certainly Muir finds in fir tree wood is that they can basically plaster the Turkish rear areas very generally, but you know, the Ottoman troops had absolutely no qualms or scruples, certainly in the early part of the campaign, of getting to grips and grapples and getting as close as humanly possible to the British regiments, knowing full well that the Royal Navy certainly won't be able to fire because you're just as much likely to hit friend or foe there, sort of thing. So the Royal Navy, as ever the Royal Navy does, sort of like does very much the best that it can. And it's quite astonishing how quickly they can respond to calls for direct assistance and gunfire to support attacks. But a lot of the time, we're dealing with the wrong type of fire. You know, this flat horizontal trajectory. The Turks, you know, the Ottoman forces were very, very adept at just withdrawing troops into nullahs, into sort of like the crevices of the ground, taking troops over onto the reverses of hills where obviously it was more or less impossible for flat trajectory fire to get them. But certainly they were there 100% all the way through. And much of the time I get the feeling that it was the professionalism of the Royal Navy in terms of the logistics and communications that really put a spine and backbone into a lot of the army operations, which is, again, a bit of a joke because essentially the army was there to help the Navy out. But a lot of the time it ended up being the other way around, that it was this sort of deep professionalism that had been drilled into the Navy, sometimes a wee bit absent from the land forces.
Yeah, and just to expand on that point about the flat trajectory of the guns, I mean, that is effectively one of the main reasons why they actually needed an infantry assault and a landing at all, because the Turkish forces have these forts and large guns on cliffs, and the Royal Navy can't do anything out at sea because they're flying on flat trajectory, so we need a landing. It comes full circle, but the Turks know it right from the start. So yeah, obviously a massive problem, not one that they can really do anything about without landing howitzers to fire over cliffs.
Yeah,
and obviously go on, Jim.
Well, we talk about a very heavily focus on the actual land forces impact at Gallipoli. We can't forget that this is a whole operation that's thought up in the Admiralty.
That's what I mean.
A naval operation that happens to include an army force, which happens to get bogged down on the peninsula. And so it's really interesting, I think, looking at it from a larger British military history perspective, because this whole theory of the British Navy carrying the British Army somewhere in the world, releasing them, they go make some massive destructive campaign and then pulling them right back out, is how the British military operated through the majority of the 19th century. Think about the Crimea, think about various campaigns in the Americas and in India. So this is one of the first time that kind of runs into a brick wall. And seeing how the Navy reacted to it as compared to how the Army reacted to it, I think is really interesting. This is also one of the first instances where the Royal Naval Air Service has a very large impact on the campaign, taking off for bases in Lemnos and some of the other Greek islands. So the Navy's impact on the campaign is absolutely massive. The Army can't do anything in this campaign without the Navy. While the Navy is protecting shipping coming across the channel for troops on the Western Front, in the end, the Army might be able to operate a bit on its own. But in every single thing, as we were talking about earlier, relies on the Royal Navy getting it from Britain through the Straits of Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean to Alexandria, then to Lemnos, then to the Gallipoli Peninsula, completely protected at a time when, you know, we don't think about it often, but German and Austrian submarines are very, very destructive in the Mediterranean. So
yeah. And certainly one of the just to bring you back round to Muir, almost to round off there, it's actually the Royal Navy almost that does for Albert Muir, because of course on the 4th of June, the attack in which he's, you know, obviously very badly psychologically wounded, he's there attempting to assist a Royal Naval Air Service armoured car over one of the trenches. So, you know, we've got a Royal Naval Air Service armoured car. You know, that really does sort of like underline the very much the innovation of the Royal Navy, which you sometimes think is a wee bit lacking of the land forces. You know, if you think about it, the 5th Royal Scots are throwing hand grenades that are made out of jam tins with screws and bits of glass in them, and we've got a Naval Air Service armoured car so, like, assisting in the attack.
And that is where he kind of does it sort of almost humorously. He talks about the fact that the armoured car fell in his trench. He gets quite annoyed about that, and then he leaves the line and has this absolute breakdown. You can tell that is the tipping point for him, and it just emphasises how bad this campaign really was. I'm not saying that it was necessarily worse psychologically on people than the Western Front, but it clearly for this person, you know, it just was extremely terrible.
Indeed.
With that, guys,
and very, very refreshingly, almost bluntly dealt with in his memoirs as well, which is not something that you really see. You know, for somebody to tackle, you know, what would now be called, you know, obviously post-traumatic stress disorder, so bluntly, so openly, and you know, there's not for a moment this idea that, well, you know, I've broken down, so I must be some kind of weakling or some kind of coward. He knows he's none of those things. Albert Muir certainly, and the good thing is to endure that, you know.
Yeah, and the good thing is that it's not necessarily, he doesn't deal with it as if we're talking about shell shock, and technically we're not talking about shell shock. Yeah. It's not from the concussion of an explosion or multiple explosions or anything. It is literally just that psychological wearing down over time, although it's not really
reached a tipping point. Yeah,
it's just that it's battle fatigue. It's a different thing, and that I expect is why he was able to write about it, and it's extremely interesting.
Well, really cool, guys. I think we've reached our hour here. Is there any final points you want to make just on the Scottish participation and Muir's as well in regards to the Gallipoli campaign?
I think really, for me, this is where my sort of enduring love for Gallipoli came from. I had a flat in Edinburgh, and I just happened to be walking around a graveyard, as one does, and I kept on seeing on a lot of the headstones, killed in action 28th of June 1915, 28th of June. I thought, what's going on the 28th of June 1915? And you know, from there, that took me into a study of you know, the Gallipoli campaign, and has got me, you know, very, very, very emotionally involved almost with the 4th and 5th Royal Scots, even to the point that I actually went to the Gallipoli sites, the beaches, the very trenches that these chaps fought in on my honeymoon. So wonderful shout out to Mrs. Clark who allowed us to do that. Well, she said she wanted to go on a beach holiday. We went on a beach holiday. Beach. We went to the mall. Good, yeah. So it was essentially this chance thing, walking through an Edinburgh graveyard, and the study of these battalions is the thing that has really made me not feel Scottish, obviously, but feel that Scotland is now my home. You know, is to get very engaged in these families and these family stories and the streets and the lives and deaths of these men.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. When I lived in Glasgow, I lived right down the street from the 6th Highland Light Infantry drill hall for a while, which is in Yorkhill. And, you know, that was another Gallipoli battalion, and seeing their memorial and the memorial of the 7th on Glasgow Green, and then seeing Glasgow University's Roll of Honor and how Gallipoli was with them. It's always been a very interesting campaign that Dave in particular has drilled into me that I need to study. much to my hesitation, but nonetheless incredibly fascinating, and one that is oft forgotten and oft misunderstood. But its impacts, not only in Australia, New Zealand, and in England, but in Scotland especially, are ones that I think we should continue to study, and we're going to continue to learn about.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay then, folks, thanks very, very much indeed for joining us. We'll be posting up details of where we'll be going and what we'll be doing next week, so just check back on the page. We'll also post up a little link to where you can get Muir's book on free download as well, so if you've been interested in this as well. I'll also try and stick up a link to Major Ewing's book, From Gallipoli to Baghdad, which is a great and actually surprisingly humorous account of a padre in the 4th Royal Scots who first saw service in Gallipoli. Thanks very much, folks. Stay safe, stay sane, and we'll see you next week with a build-up. Thanks. Thanks.